let's go. So, dear Professor Mardis, so it's an honor for us to welcome you at Evry University. I know that you understand very well French, and because of the audience, I will now turn in French. I hope that you will understand what I say. So, Madame la professeure Hélène Mardy, bienvenue à l'Université d'Evry. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de faire un très rapide tour d'horizon de notre établissement. Cette université est multidisciplinaire. Elle est âgée d'à peine plus 25 ans. C'est bien jeune au regard des universités vénérables institutions qui vous ont accueillis. Et votre présence ici, soyez convaincus, est un immense honneur, c'est une fierté, c'est aussi une évidence au regard de notre ambition qui, comme la vôtre, est tout entière orientée vers la transformation de notre monde d'une façon inédite, surprenante et durable. Notre ambition, vous le savez, est portée par le travail ardent d'un ensemble de laboratoires qui sont ici présents pour mettre Evry à la pointe des biothérapies innovantes. Cela concerne le domaine des cellules souches au laboratoire ISTEM, et on sait le succès de ce laboratoire en matière de peau, en matière de rétine. C'est tout le travail de conception des vecteurs pour la thérapie génique intégrative, pour le muscle, et c'est un vrai défi pour le monde, ardu. Des vecteurs pour des applications en immunohématologie à Généton, et nous venons d'obtenir la création par l'INSERM d'un accélérateur de recherche technologique sur la thérapie génomique ici à Evry. Nos recherches, ce sont également des travaux théoriques et appliqués sur les interactions moléculaires multi-échelles au sein des laboratoires LAMB et SABNP. Et comprenez que toutes ces avancées s'appuient sur la connaissance approfondie des génomes que l'on génère ici à travers l'extraordinaire dynamique et la concentration de cerveau de l'Institut de génomique du CEA, qui inclut le Centre national de recherche en génomique humaine, détenteur d'une très longue expertise, vous le savez, en génotypage, et maintenant totalement investi dans la recherche de signatures génomiques à la source de phénomènes pathologiques comme le cancer, ou bien des signatures génomiques témoins de l'impact de notre environnement sur notre propre génome. Ce sont ici, encore à Evry, les grands projets de métagénomique du Génoscope qui transforment radicalement notre vision du peuple microscopique qui habite notre planète, qui apportent aussi une vision sur ses multiples interactions et dépendances, qui trouvent un prolongement naturel dans l'analyse fine du métabolisme, appuyée sur la génomique métabolique au sein de l'unité du même nom, avec, vous le comprenez, des applications en biologie de synthèse dont le potentiel est sans limite. Tous ces travaux ne peuvent vivre sans formalisme statistique et sans une bioinformatique puissante et avancée. On sait qu'une des clés des succès en génomique réside là, dans cette conjugaison de la bioinformatique et des statistiques, et je sais que vous êtes ardente ambassadrice, et c'est tout l'esprit des travaux et des recherches qui sont menées ici à Evry, au Centre national de génotypage, le CNRGH aujourd'hui, dans notre laboratoire de mathématiques et de modélisation, ainsi qu'au laboratoire IBISC, dont les travaux sont concentrés sur l'analyse et la compréhension de systèmes complexes vivants et artificiels et le développement d'interfaces pour les interactions homme-machine. L'expertise que vous sentez, j'espère, transpirer de ce tour rapide d'horizon est aussi le terreau d'une autre dynamique qui se déroule ici à Evry, d'une dynamique industrielle unique en France et au premier rang en Europe, portée par Génopôle et par la FM Téléthon. Cela vous sera présenté dans quelques instants par Jean-Marc Grenier. Cette dynamique se porte vers le malade, c'est évident, pour soigner des maladies incurables, mais vise également à répondre aux grands enjeux sociétaux, notamment ceux de la transition énergétique, de l'environnement ou de la chimie verte, en s'appuyant sur les biotechnologies. C'est pour toutes ces raisons, c'est pour cette concentration des savoirs et de leurs applications que la France a enfin choisi Evry comme centre d'expertise, d'instruments et de méthodes pour le plan que vous connaissez bien, ce plan France Médecine Génomique 2025, qui va apporter dans les toutes prochaines années la génomique au lit du malade partout en France comme un nouvel outil puissant de diagnostic et pour orienter le sujet qui vous est cher, les traitements personnalisés. Traitements personnalisés, médecine de précision, voilà qui nous amène très naturellement à vous, Hélène, à votre carrière. Et c'est pour ça que vous êtes ici, à ce que vous avez apporté au monde et dont l'écho résonne fortement ici à Évry. Je ne peux rentrer dans le détail de votre activité foisonnante pour nos auditeurs qui sont nombreux, je les remercie, qui viennent, vous le comprenez, de tous ces horizons pour vous entendre et vous saluer. Mais pour vous résumer, si je peux oser, je dirais qu'une des caractéristiques de votre parcours est d'avoir fait basculer un champ, celui de l'exploration de notre diversité génétique, du stade de l'artisanat à celui de l'âge adulte, pour faire la génomique d'aujourd'hui, qui est une industrie à haut débit qui nous inonde de données massives. Ce chemin, votre chemin, a nécessité de faire évoluer l'art du séquençage en y introduisant une rationalité rigoureuse pour que l'ensemble de cet art, de la prise de l'échantillon jusqu'au rendu final des résultats, soit de qualité, pour constituer une source de données fiable qui est à la base de toute valeur ajoutée, quel que soit le domaine visé, pour l'utilisation des dites données. Cette transformation à laquelle vous avez participé d'un pan entier de la recherche instrumentale, vous l'avez réussi car au-delà de votre expertise en matière de technologie, il en a fallu une autre qui est capitale elle aussi, l'expertise que vous possédez en étant cet entrepreneur hors pair, que le monde entier salue. Les progrès fulgurants que vous avez apportés dans l'industrialisation du séquençage vous ont naturellement amené à être rapidement et totalement impliqué dans le consortium international qui a apporté à l'humanité la première séquence du génome de l'homme. Le Human Genome Project, on le sait, a mobilisé pendant 13 ans des équipes à travers le monde, dont celle d'Évry. Une des motivations était bien au départ, au-delà de la recherche fondamentale qui est essentielle, d'apporter la matière pour comprendre les causes des affections héréditaires ou acquises qui nous touchent tous. L'ère naissante de la génomique à haut débit, que vous avez fortement contribué à mettre sur une rampe de lancement, vous a ainsi rapproché de la clinique humaine, de l'homme souffrant, ce qui était loin de votre formation initiale, très loin. C'est alors le début d'une autre série de succès qui vous honore. Et pour cette bataille, vous avez été guidé par votre intuition, par votre conviction personnelle profonde que toute cette connaissance était mûre pour soigner l'homme. Et votre premier succès pour guérir s'appuie sur votre idée de séquencer entièrement le génome d'une tumeur cancéreuse afin de le comparer à celui d'un tissu sain de la même personne pour tenter de révéler, de mettre en évidence des éléments qui permettraient d'orienter le traitement de ce cancer, de le personnaliser. Le coût et la chance de succès semblaient tous deux déraisonnables au NIH, notre INSERM, qui a refusé de vous financer. Et ce n'est que grâce à cet autre don, votre pouvoir de conviction, que vous avez pu trouver et le mécène et le $1 million nécessaires à l'époque, il y a juste 10 ans, pour mener à bien ce projet. Le résultat, tout le monde le connaît, fut de pouvoir proposer un traitement inédit, mais parfaitement adapté à ce patient. Vous l'avez sauvé. Vous avez sauvé là votre première vie, il y a maintenant presque 10 ans. C'était, c'est vrai, un pari risqué, et vous n'aviez d'ailleurs, d'après mes petites antennes, pas tout à fait les méthodes, notamment en bioinformatique, pour y arriver. Cela montre votre audace, votre esprit visionnaire. C'est pourquoi ce succès, maintenant légendaire, représente un tournant dans votre carrière qui elle-même est en train de devenir en entier une odyssée, j'en suis certain. Car à partir de là, grâce à la baisse incroyable des coûts des séquençages, grâce à la fiabilisation des données qui s'améliore d'année en année, ces travaux ont ouvert une nouvelle route dans laquelle vous vous êtes engouffré, encore avec d'immenses succès, pour personnaliser le traitement du cancer, par ce que l'on appelle la pharmacogénomique, qui consiste à mettre en adéquation un traitement médicamenteux avec les causes moléculaires profondes du cancer. Et surtout, la pharmacogénomique permet de sortir des sentiers classiques de ce traitement du cancer où la part du hasard est trop grande, avec trop d'échecs, trop d'effets secondaires. Mais là encore, avec votre esprit de pionnier qui vous habite, la pharmacogénomique ne vous a pas suffi. Maintenant, c'est une toute autre ambition qui vous porte. Vous vous êtes lancé avec brio dans l'immunothérapie, la vaccination personnalisée dans le cancer, une vaccination à la carte, adaptée à chaque individu, en s'appuyant sur la connaissance des protéines anormales fabriquées par le cancer, ces fameux néo-antigènes qui sont des cibles de choix. Voilà la nouvelle corde à votre arc, j'allais dire en attendant la suivante. Et comprenez, Madame Hélène Mardy, comprenez, Mesdames et Messieurs, qu'il s'agit bien ici d'un nouveau pas. Il s'agit de mettre au point des traitements qui s'affranchissent, comprenez-le cette fois-ci, de toute administration de médicaments anticancéreux dont on connaît l'énorme impact négatif sur la qualité de vie des patients. Votre parcours, si brièvement résumé, pardonnez-moi, a un centre, à mon sens, rationalisé. Rationalisé pour que les données soient rendues zéro défaut. C'est la démarche qualité sévère qui vous a valu tous ces succès. C'est aussi une exigence intellectuelle pour poser les bonnes questions. Pourquoi, dans certains cas, 10% des patients en apparence condamnés peuvent répondre à un médicament? Mais surtout, pourquoi les 90 autres % ne répondent pas au même traitement? Votre trajectoire, Madame Mardy, s'inscrit parfaitement dans ce devoir de connaissance que conseillait l'aphorisme inscrit au fronton du temple d'Apollon à Delphes. « Connais-toi toi-même ». Aphorisme magistralement mis en œuvre par Socrate pour approcher de la vérité. Ce que vous avez créé, chère Hélène, est en ligne droite avec rien moins que l'esprit de Socrate, avec ce qu'il nous proposait il y a plus de 2000 ans. Connais-toi toi-même, car la génomique permet aujourd'hui au monde, à l'homme, de se connaître comme jamais il ne s'est connu. Le séquençage profond, dans toutes ses dimensions, et à haut débit, est un nouvel observatoire, comme celui du mont Wilson, un incroyable observatoire. C'est une pupille qui apporte des données sur notre moi profond, pour savoir qui nous sommes, en entrant dans l'intérieur de notre propre intimité, d'une façon inédite et révolutionnaire. Car le génome et ses extensions explorent la complexité profonde de l'homme, les fondements de ce qu'il est. Le génome témoigne aussi de notre histoire évolutive et montre que nous portons tous une part de nos ancêtres qui, eux aussi, ont évolué pour devenir aujourd'hui nos cousins, je parle des plantes et des animaux. Et c'est alors que la parole de Pascal prend un sens nouveau quand il s'exclamait « Quelle chimère est-ce donc l'homme ?» Quelle chimère! Et au-delà de tout cela, de cette extraordinaire plongée dans le temps passé qui nous amène au présent à travers le génome, nous voyons aussi que la génomique sera le pivot de toute description du normal et du pathologique, de l'inné et de l'acquis, et au-delà de l'impact de nos comportements et de notre frottement au monde, j'entends de nos habitudes et nos expositions. Et ce génome qui éclairera demain, car il porte en nous, et ce génome, nous éclairera aussi demain, car il porte en nous-mêmes le message du futur. Vous avez ainsi ouvert une fenêtre sur un univers constitué d'une multitude d'autres univers emboîtés, aux implications sociales et sociétales majeures. Et je reviens donc à l'aphorisme du temple d'Apollon à Delphes. Tout le monde en connaît la première partie, connais-toi toi-même, mais parfois on oublie la seconde, laisse le monde aux dieux. Socrate lui-même, en son temps, avait laissé la seconde partie de cet aphorisme, car il souhaitait transformer l'homme pour reprendre aux dieux ce que les hommes leur avaient donné. À cette époque où la mythologie dominait le monde, un dieu était responsable de tout événement, heureux ou malheureux. Les hommes n'étaient pas responsables, ne s'interrogeaient même pas sur eux-mêmes. On sait la fin de Socrate, on sait son rejet par la société athénienne, on sait le procès qu'on lui a fait, sa condamnation à mort. Tout cela accéléré par la chute d'Athènes face aux Spartiates, il fallait bien trouver un coupable. Si je me permets ce petit écart par nos racines grecques, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, comme hier, la science et la technologie ne peuvent ignorer la réflexion sur la condition humaine. Et parallèlement à cela, vous voyez que les fanatismes persistent, que les fanatismes menacent. Il nous faut donc avancer avec les humanités pour ne pas se tromper de chemin, pour que la science soit intelligible. Et je sais votre engagement pour le dialogue science et société, qui est encore une de vos médaille, qui vous honore et qui implique que l'on se comprenne avec la société. Car comme le disait encore Socrate à Alcibiade, mieux vaut une ignorance qui se connaît qu'une ignorance qui s'ignore, car dans l'ignorance qui s'ignore est là la source de tous les fanatismes. La connaissance des génomes, voyez, messieurs, dames, est un extraordinaire message de paix. Il nous reste à nous, scientifiques, de le faire comprendre.
You have been, you are, and you will be a pioneer in the field of the use of genomic sequencing, in the field of immuno-oncology, for treating, not only treating, but to cure, it's better, to cure cancer. Francis Quetier will, Professor Francis Quetier will present your complete curriculum and showing your impressive work in the field of personalized medicine. As Professor Kurmi said, you understand very well French. You learn French at school, and I will switch in French. Il était logique que Génopôle s'associe à cette cérémonie car au-delà des liens personnels qui unissent Génopôle et vous-même, les travaux qui sont menés à Génopôle est en résonance avec votre carrière, avec ce qu'a exprimé le professeur Kurmi, c'est-à-dire à la fois une chercheuse, une entrepreneuse, quelqu'un qui prend des risques et quelqu'un qui apprécie le lien entre la science et la société, des valeurs que partage totalement Génopôle. Génopôle a été créé en 1998, il y a maintenant 20 ans, par Pierre Tambourin. Pierre Tambourin, vous prie de l'excuser d'être absent aujourd'hui. Il a été sollicité par la ministre de la Recherche pour venir exposer un rapport qu'il a rendu l'année dernière sur les liens entre la valorisation dans le secteur public et les universités. La ministre souhaite réactiver et prendre certainement en considération certaines des recommandations de Pierre. Et Pierre était vraiment mortifié, le mot est très clair, de ne pouvoir être présent aujourd'hui. Et je m'exprimerai aujourd'hui beaucoup en son nom. Donc, Génopôle a été créé en 1998 pour positionner la France dans la génomique qui se développait à ce moment-là et qui prenait tout son essor, et pour participer au séquençage du génome humain. Je présume que Francis en parlera, comme vous l'avez fait également, et vous en étiez partie prenante. Et établir les bases de ce qui, à l'époque, allait devenir la médecine du futur, basée sur notre connaissance intime du génome, ce qui est aujourd'hui la médecine du présent et sera la médecine du futur. Au début, était l'AFM. L'AFM était présent, l'AFM Téléthon était présent ici, sur ce site, avant Génopôle. L'AFM qui était une association de parents d'enfants atteints de maladies, d'une maladie rare, qui atteignait le muscle. Et ces parents ont voulu donner un mot qui était le mot espoir. C'est-à-dire comprendre que, au travers de la recherche, au travers des actions que l'on pourrait mener dans la recherche, il y avait l'espoir de trouver des thérapeutiques pour les patients. À l'époque, il n'y avait pas de solution, et c'est vraiment l'AFM qui a ouvert cette voie. Génopôle, aujourd'hui, illustre totalement, là encore, votre parcours. Aujourd'hui, 19 laboratoires de recherche regroupant plus d'1 millier d'acteurs, principalement autour de la génomique, la postgénomique, les biotechnologies en général. On a tendance à dire à Génopôle, notre ADN, c'est l'ADN. C'est également plus de 86 entreprises qui ont été créées sur le site, qui ont rejoint le site, parce que Génopôle is the place to be, lorsque l'on veut faire de la génomique. Et de nombreuses entreprises nous ont rejoints au cours des dernières années. Mais non seulement ça, mais nous avons aussi aidé à la création de projets innovants dans le domaine de la médecine. En 20 ans, les progrès ont été vertigineux, grâce à des chercheurs comme vous, dans ce domaine. Une baisse du coût du séquençage, qui a été déjà évoqué tout à l'heure. On parle aujourd'hui d'un génome à 1 000 €. La question n'est pas de savoir si un jour ce génome coûtera 100 €, c'est de savoir quand. Dans 3 ans, dans 6 ans, dans 9 ans, mais on sait que ce sera vrai. Ça a été d'identifier les causes moléculaires, les causes génétiques de nombreuses maladies rares pour lesquelles il était difficile, voire impossible, de poser un vrai diagnostic. C'est le commencement de traiter au niveau de l'ADN les patients par thérapie génique et par d'autres voies. Vous en avez, et je pense que vous en présenterez quelques-unes aujourd'hui. Et Génopôle a été partie prenante, les équipes de Génopôle, les entreprises de Génopôle ont été partie prenante dans ces progrès et ces avancées, là encore grâce aux travaux pionniers qu'ont pu mener, que vous avez menés, que d'autres ont menés. La médecine personnalisée aujourd'hui nous ouvre des voies, des perspectives extraordinaires. Identifier les gènes qui permettent de prédire la réaction aux médicaments. Nous savons que sur des pathologies comme le cancer, traiter le bon patient au bon moment, avec le bon produit, à la bonne dose, est quelque chose d'indispensable, de nécessaire. Et tout n'est pas inscrit dans nos gènes, mais en tout cas, cet élément déjà est inscrit dans nos gènes. C'est également identifier les patients qui sont susceptibles de faire des effets secondaires. Je ne le dirai ni en grec ni en latin, mais premier principe pour des pharmaciens, pour les médecins, c'est d'abord ne pas nuire. C'est-à-dire d'abord ne pas donner des médicaments qui peuvent entraîner des effets secondaires, qui peuvent éventuellement même tuer le patient. Eh bien, aujourd'hui, on sait, ou on pense savoir, ou on pense que l'on saura bientôt, grâce au décodage du génome, individuellement, pouvoir savoir si des patients bénéficieront ou pas d'un traitement, ou feront ou pas des effets secondaires. C'est cette médecine personnalisée, la bonne dose, au bon moment, au bon patient. C'est ce que veut développer également la France dans le domaine du plan France Médecine Génomique. Vous avez participé aux évaluations, vous le connaissez bien, ce plan qui vise à doter la France d'une dizaine de plateformes de séquençage dans les hôpitaux français qui permettront, sur prescription médicale, d'établir le génome des patients, des génomes de leurs tumeurs. Ce plan France Médecine Génomique a été lancé, les 2 premières plateformes ont été identifiées, seront dotées, j'espère, en fonctionnement dès l'année prochaine. Ce plan est piloté par Avicent. Génopôle y a contribué au départ à sa naissance, et puis y contribuera parce qu'il accueillera, espérons très bientôt, le centre de référence de ce plan, c'est-à-dire le centre qui établira pour l'ensemble des plateformes françaises les procédures, qui validera les techniques et qui fera que dans toutes les plateformes, on utilisera les mêmes méthodes, validées de la même façon, donnant les chances équivalentes à tous les patients, quel que soit l'endroit où ils habitent. J'avais cité également le mot espoir au début. Je voulais vous dire et vous remercier au nom de nous tous. Vous avez illustré ce mot espoir, Patrick l'a dit. Vous avez montré que le cancer n'était pas inéluctable et vous avez montré que par une connaissance précise des gènes, il était possible de trouver le bon produit pour le bon patient. On dit souvent qu'une très bonne hypothèse ne nécessite pas de nombreux patients. Il suffit d'une expérience positive. Vous l'avez faite, vous l'avez tentée. Et c'est, je crois, le plus beau mot qu'on peut ajouter, l'espoir que vous nous avez donné dans ces technologies. Merci à vous.
Dear Professor Elaine Mardis, dear Elaine, we know each other since more than 10 years. It's my great pleasure to describe your huge and impressive scientific career, which is very difficult to sum up because we have to take into account that you have published so far 26 articles, giving rise to 79,000 of citations taken from 62,000 papers. It's tremendous. This is why you are qualified by the factor impact over 100 points. I checked yesterday, it was 106, not 100. And so it's impossible to sum up everything in 15 minutes, but I therefore chosen to select the principal milestone of your career. Scientific career and medical concern as well. You were born in Nebraska. Your father was a distinguished chemist professor in the university. And this has a big consequence because you fell very early and very deeply addicted completely to science for the rest of your life. You began by zoology and you switched a couple of years after to biochemistry and chemistry to achieve a PhD in the Oklahoma University that you gained in 1989. And this was the first turn in your career because you met Bruce Rowe, who you told me passed 2 months ago, who was a bright scientific and genomist before the year, because he was the one who used all the techniques and also he mastered all the techniques. And at this time, he was the first scientist to use the new release apparatus to sequence, which was using the fluorescent dye. And Bruce was also a good teacher, a good mentor, a good grader. And you benefit from the grader of Bruce. And he told you any tricks, any good finger for doing your PCR and sequencing. So that he drive you to the Biorad USA company to get a senior officer position to do research, where you insulate the quality control in a company. It's a hard work at this time. In this occasion, both in Oklahoma University and with Bruce Rowe, you met a colleague whose name is Rick Wilson. Sounds something to you? Yes, because they match each other in terms of the behavior regarding science and progresses and protocols and genomics, so that they decided to make something which is unique to my knowledge. There is a tandem between Rick Wilson and Elaine Mardis since 25 years. This is the success, okay? And there was a turn in 1993 when you joined the Genome Institute within Washington University, which is nicknamed WashU, shorter, in St. Louis, not in Washington, of course. And your tandem launched a research group to enter this new area of genomics. The landscape of genomics changed dramatically that year because you were awarded a grant of several $1 million to sequence the first animal genome, which was Caenorhabditis elegans, and which was first a challenge because it was a big, between brackets at this time, genome, a little bit over 100 megabases. We just finished the bacterial discovery, only 10 megabases. And here there was another challenge. The challenge was to make the industrialization and to get the most convenient apparatus to win this challenge. It was a prelude for the Human Genome Program, which was launched because of the success of this cooperation between your group and the group headed by John Solston in the Sanger Center in UK. I'm quoting now an interview from Rick Wilson during those days when you are going to scale up everything in the Genome Center. And Rick said, we really needed someone who had been thinking about the technology 100% of the time. I had followed Elaine's work in the grad school and at the Bio-Rad company, and I thought that she was clearly the only person in the genome community who could get it right. And I would add personally that you did right, perfectly. I met your tandem with Rick Wilson during the Arabidopsis Genome Initiative in 1996, and I discovered Rick Wilson, who was a perfect gentleman in science and in the life. And during those days, we began to sequence the flowering plant with Rick and many others. Marcel Salandouba is here and was responsible Genoscope for this genome sequencing. I remember that during those days, you were considered, Elaine, either as the magic woman or the DNA wizard. Why? Because she received most of the time a sample of a crazy DNA fragment with bizarre composition, rich in ATI, rich in GC, and with a structure completely bizarre. And these samples were sent by colleagues desesperating to get any information about the DNA, and she challenged it. And she won the challenge because most of the people received the correct sequence. She acquired a renew in the international committee. This done, the group in WashU took place to a major part of the human genome sequencing. They sequenced 3 of the human chromosome, the chromosome 2, chromosome 4, and chromosome 7, and put their finger also in the other chromosome as well to finish. So this is a very good contribution. A decisive turn took place around 2002 when you started working in the lab of Harold Varmus a couple of years before he got the Nobel Prize. And you were working on cancer. This is a turn, definitely. And your task was to develop genomic biomarkers. And you began to succeed rapidly. After a few years, you were working on acute myeloid leukemia, which is a terrible disease because the prognostic is very bad. And Rick and you started a visionary project, meeting the feeling of Patrick. It's a visionary project. I mean the complete sequencing of a human tumor. You definitely like challenges, and big challenges, not things like that, but planetary concern. You present your progress on this human tumor sequencing in the Cold Spring Harbor meeting on personal genome in 2008, and it is here that we met for the first time and we have some discussion. On 2010, you achieved the worldwide pioneering success when you established for the first time the complete sequencing of a tumor, a human tumor. And this has a story that I can tell you. The story is that Rick was and Elaine got in touch by a surgeon from WashU in the hospital because the MD has a problem with a lady. It was a 39 years old lady suffering from an acute myeloid leukemia. And the surgeon made a series of PCR tests to check which mutation was causal. And he didn't find any. All the ones which have been so far recorded, there were 50. It was 51, which is not known. So Rick Wilson and Elaine asked the regulatory committee of the WashU to allow the sequencing of the lady. And this was done in a very short time because we were not prepared to do that, a couple of weeks. And the result that it was another mutation, a very complicated thing, an insertion fusion. And the lady benefit for her relapse because it was she was close to die. She was at the first, a second relapse, and we don't have the time for a third one. You have to induce a remission quickly and securely. And this was done, and the lady survived with any recipe. So this sequence-based personalized medicine was born and already proven to be efficient. The first case, the first success. Later on, and quite unexpectedly, Elaine Mardis has been the heroine of another success story which took place in her own lab. Dr. Lucas Wartman, a bright young scientist, MD and PhD, was also suffering from an acute myeloid leukemia, and he was in a second relapse. So Elaine knew how to do, but the first result of the whole genome sequence did not bring anything, and the whole exome did not afford any correct information. So Elaine's team decided to go through the transcriptome, RNA-seq, but before the year, and found a high expression of one gene, the FDL3, which was known as a causative gene for another cancer affecting the kidney in human. And the cherry on the cake is that in the human treatment, there was a drug named Sutent, which fight against the overexpression of the gene. So Dr. Lucas was treated. The remission took place very early, and he's still alive and active. I don't know where he is now, but he's still active. Elaine Mardis and Rick Wilson decided 2 years ago, it was in May 2016, to move to another place. And they are now working in Columbus, in Ohio, in pediatric oncology, which is a very difficult thing to do. They have been sequencing in a big program more than 800 children for their cancer. So Elaine Mardis is a very fine specialist in medical genomics. She thought during a short period of time to follow a medical doctor cursus, but it was not possible because of a major contraindication. She can't stand the sight of blood. It's a major contradiction. But take care. Don't try to push her. She is no novice in martial arts. She likes playing golf, cooking, and vacation in France as well. To finish, Elaine Mardis received many awards, and she is going to have another one today. Aside of her international top-ranked scientific accomplishment, Elaine Mardis is also an extraordinary charismatic person. You take the
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. First of all, taking time to come to this very important and honorary day for me. I'm really very humbled by the recognition and very happy that my first doctor honoris causa is happening here in France, which is a country that I really love, the language as well, and the culture and the food, of course, and especially at Evry, where the history of genomics, as you've heard, if you didn't already know, this afternoon is so profound and so important and so contributory to the knowledge that I'll talk about today that lays the foundations for what we're doing in cancer, and I think sets us forward in the future. Cancer, of course, is an international problem, and so this is an international endeavor. I'll talk today about some of the work that we're doing, but I ask you to keep in mind two things. One, this is not all about me. What I'll represent is the work of a very large number of people, all of whom are committed and continue to be so to this very hard problem. And two, this is a worldwide collaboration, because the more we find out individually about cancer, share that information, the better we can do a job of helping our patients moving forward with the genomics and other approaches that we have for this disease. So I'll just spend a few minutes giving you a brief history and then just finish with some of my visions for the future of the work that we hope to do now. And I want to start, we all have scientific heroes in life. This is one of mine, Janet Rowley. She just passed away a few years ago, but spent the bulk of her career at the University of Chicago in the US. She was a pathologist by training, an MD, and she was a visionary because she began in the 1970s while her husband was on sabbatical in the UK. Looking through a microscope in a tiny dark closet which was the only space she could garner because it was her husband's sabbatical, not hers. Looking through the microscope at cancer diagnosis, at chromosomes that she had developed the techniques to stretch out and compress and look at and put dyes into. And she began to sense then patterns in these chromosomes where specific alterations of the chromosomes matched with the diagnosis that those cancer patients were receiving for different types of leukemia. And as we now know with our different microscope, which I'll talk about today, next generation sequencing, the things that Janet found under the microscope were truly diagnostic and can be recapitulated very well with next-generation sequencing. So I like to think of the next-generation sequencer as a different kind of microscope. She was just about 40 years too early to use what I used. And of course, as was also mentioned, and is critically important to this endeavor, is the sequencing of the human genome. Without this template, as I'll describe, we wouldn't be able to do the things that we can do today with next-generation sequencing, because the genome is very large, 3 billion base pairs. The pieces of DNA that we sequence are very tiny by comparison, about 100 base pairs, and we need not only the ability to produce lots and lots of sequence, but also the computational ability to evaluate where these fragments came from, how they're different from one another and from that human reference genome, as a springboard to really understanding what's gone wrong in a cancer patient's genome. And so this is a critically important piece of information. It was an international project, much of which took place here, much of which took place in the United States, England, everywhere. And as you'll see reflected in my comments in a minute, this has now been recapitulated in the cancer approach, which is also an international approach to really teasing out the sequence differences in cancer genomes. So I think this is really the major point of generating a resource that we can now use over and over again today, both in basic research and also in the clinic, and I'll try and describe that for you. So the other piece of the puzzle is really how we use the human genome in our use of next-generation sequencing. This is just a text description that tells you that we basically sequence a tumor, we sequence the normal DNA from that same individual, we compare them individually to the human reference genome, and then find differences, and those differences get compared to one another. That tells us two things: the DNA alterations you're born with, your germline, or constitutional DNA, which can include a susceptibility to cancer, and I'll talk about this, and two, the changes that have been brought on in the process of developing cancer, those somatic alterations that we want to know about, as was described earlier, in terms of which therapy to use to help treat the cancer. And so this alignment and analysis of DNA and RNA is really the underpinnings of everything that I'll talk about today. And this just describes this first cancer patients that was alluded to by Professor Kurmi and Professor Quetier, that we sequenced as part of this bold experiment that cost us $1 million to generate the data. We were not given that by the NIH, as you heard, but rather a private donor gave us this money to do this experiment for the very first time ever. It was much too early in the history of next-generation sequencing. The sequencers that we used were barely in our lab for a year, and we were just learning how to make them work. But also, the really challenging part was that the bioinformatics, that comparison of the DNA sequence back to the human reference to discover changes, had never been done before. And so we had two challenges: how to produce the data and how to pay for it, and how to do the analysis to identify mutations. And as you can see, what we identified in this patient's genome for the very first genome were 10 alterations to the DNA. At the time, we didn't know if that was too many, too few, what was the right number, but we now know, having sequenced hundreds of AML genomes subsequently, that on average, patients across the spectrum of subtypes of AML have about 12 mutations in genes. So we were pretty close to the average by finding only 10. The other thing that's been transformational, of course, and many of you know this, is the decreasing cost of how much it costs to sequence the genome, as well as the time to generate the data, has become extraordinarily truncated. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the instrument that we use for most of the human genome sequencing and other genomes, such as mouse, monkeys, etc. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see sort of the newest sequencing instrument that can sequence a genome in about 45 hours for about $1,000, and doesn't do just one genome at a time, but does many genomes at a time. Of course, as I always argue, and I'm a bit famous for this, just generating the data isn't enough. We have to do the bioinformatics to do the analysis, and this remains to be a bit of a challenge, which we continue to work on to this day to make it faster and more accurate. But be that as it may, these instruments have been transformational, not only in our ability to gain knowledge about cancer, which I'll talk about next, but also to translate that into the clinical care of cancer patients, where turning around an answer in a very short period of time is absolutely essential. As I mentioned already, springboarding from the Human Genome Project to the International Cancer Genome Project, as you can see on this map of the world, many hundreds and thousands of cancers have now been sequenced as part of this international effort, and we better understand the genomic drivers of cancer development as a result of these efforts. What do we understand best? I can distill it down to sort of three major findings, although there are many more than that, but if you'll forgive me. First of all, the cancer genes are not unique to individual tissues. We find the same genes often mutated in many different tissue sites where cancer occurs. Secondly, the alterations to cancer genes, from point mutations to highly complicated structural alterations, are many, and they can happen in many different combinations with one another. So this complexity of cancer is what we often refer to, in that every individual patient finds ways to put together different changes at the level of DNA that ultimately lead to the same end result, and that is the development of cancer. And then lastly, that cancer is not really a disease of genes, but rather a disease of the pathways, those biological pathways that control the cell's growth and division, but as a result of these alterations, now spiral out of control so that the cancer cells continue to grow and divide at an unhindered rate and to metastasize throughout the body. So these are really some of the foundational truths that we came up with by virtue of these large-scale cancer genomics projects that I've been telling you about. The other thing that we found out is that the same genes can be either mutated in the germline or in the somatic tissue. And so this presents us with a need not only to study the DNA that you're born with, but also to study the DNA of your tumor, so that that pathway-based evaluation is as complete as it possibly can be when we go to the next step, which is trying to figure out what drugs to use to treat your cancer. So at the end of all of this, what we have is big data, and that is both a pleasure and a challenge. So from large-scale projects, we've generated huge amounts of information about all of these cancer genomes. These are now being databased in warehouses, such as this one shown here, the Genomic Data Commons, which is at the University of Chicago, but there are many others, including ones here in Europe. And now we add in the detail that's associated with the clinical care of patients. With the mutations in hand, what are the drugs that those patients have been treated with? How have they responded? What was the duration of the response, and others? And these are now coalescing in big data resources such as the CBioPortal, which is shown here, and also a project that I've been involved with, Project Genie, which is sponsored by AACR, which, as you can see, is an international effort to data warehouse all of this information, mutations as well as clinical data. So I think this is a very exciting time now because we can use these big data resources to really advance the treatment of cancer. And I'll talk about how that works, at least in my little world, here in the next few slides. So first of all, just talking about cancer genomics and how we apply discovery to clinical translation. How do we take this wealth of knowledge and make it meaningful for every patient in our clinics? And I'll just use this by providing some examples to highlight the ways that we think about this. So one of the things that comes out of big data is really the ability to ask questions and to get answers in a very complex way for a very complex disease. And because there's an uptick in the number of cancer drugs that are being now trialed in clinical trials, we can actually put together not only our genomic data resources, but also information about those drugs so that when we design clinical trials, they're much more informed. We know better which patients to go after in terms of their tissue site. We know which mutations to look for, and we also understand what I call the genomic context of those mutations. After all, cancer mutations don't happen in isolation, as I've already told you. They happen in the context of several other genes that are also mutated, both in the germline and in the somatic tissue. And we have to know about all of those in advance to really understand patients that are going to respond and patients that are unlikely to respond. And this gets us two things. It gets us a more efficient clinical trial, and it also gets us faster to approval so that more patients can actually receive those drugs for care of their cancer. So the way I sort of look at this is, how do we apply cancer genomics? And I'll just walk you through a few vignettes to try and illustrate this for you better. So in a simple form, when we look at the use of cancer sequencing, as you'll see in the top box, the tumor normal comparison, the analysis to identify somatic and germline variants, we can sort of put this in two different areas, as I've already pointed out. What are the mutations that you're born with? And in the simplest sense, we've always understood genetic susceptibility to cancer. It's just that we know more about it now because we have a much broader look through the use of next-generation sequencing. And then on the left-hand side, for somatic variants, we know now about gene-drug interactions, which are those mutations that are likely to predict response to therapy. The challenge of next-generation sequencing, almost, however, is we know too much. We find out too many mutations often from sequencing that we don't really understand in terms of their functional impact on the protein. And so this remains a vexing problem, that there probably aren't enough cell line and mouse models in the world to help us address this question straight up. So what I'll tell you about next is something that's very new. It's just being published in Nature today, and really gives us a bit of a window into maybe how this could be done. It revolves around these new designs of clinical trials that come from all of this information I've been telling you about. One form of clinical trial that's shown here is the basket trial. And the basket trial basically builds upon this notion that I told you about earlier. Mutations in cancer genes occur in multiple tissue sites. And so one way to test new drugs is to throw every patient with that gene mutated into a basket, regardless of which tissue that cancer has occurred in, and test that drug to see if it works, put simply. The corollary to this is the so-called umbrella trial, very appropriate on a day like today, yeah, the parapluie. And so we see here that people who are under the different umbrellas actually have different tissue sites with different mutations. So in the top level, there's a specific gene that's mutated, and they are being treated with one drug. The second umbrella involves a different drug, and so on. But what I'll tell you about just briefly is this trial that's being published in Nature today. This is not my work, but I'll tell you my connection to it in just a moment. And this is really, in my mind, the epitome of the basket trial that I told you about. It's testing a drug called neratinib, which is meant to address patients with mutations in HER2 or HER3. These are families, in a gene family members. And what you can see is this trial, which is published by a large group, including folks from the Memorial Sloan Cancer Center, is like a basket trial. So it acknowledges that these HER2 and HER3 point mutations are in different tissue sites, breast, lung, colon, etc. It tested this in a number of patients, and what they found is very interesting. I'll let you read the paper because it's long and I don't want to take too much time talking about other people's work, but the bottom line is right at the end here. Response to therapy involves what specific mutation you have, what tissue it's occurring in, and importantly, what other genes are also mutated at the same time. All the things I already told you, but now we've actually tested this in a clinical trial. And importantly, some of the patients in this clinical trial had mutations that didn't have a known response to this drug based on mouse models or cell lines, and they actually got a response. So this is very exciting. I was so excited about it that as a reviewer of the paper, I also wrote a companion news and views, which will come out electronically in the same issue this afternoon. And this is just a simple figure that we put together to help illustrate the results of this. The other interesting finding from this trial is that although preclinical models had indicated that mutations in HER3, the similar family protein, would respond to neratinib, in the 16 patients that were tested in this trial, none of those patients actually achieved any response to the drug. So again, maybe we are the best model for ultimately testing some of these unknown mutations in an efficacious way. I want to move quickly now to cancer susceptibility. I'll tell you again about a very special case that we were able to identify. And here, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that I've added in a few things, which are fairly new. These are information that we get from sequencing the germline, the normal tissue of each patient, that can tell us not only about cancer susceptibility, but now about how we might treat those patients. And so I'll let you read those for yourself while I tell you about a very special patient that conforms to this type of description. The other reason for telling you about this patient is because now patients with a germline susceptibility known as mismatch repair defect, or MMRD, like these patients shown in this clinical trial with colorectal and other cancers, they're unable to repair the mistakes that happen during DNA replication, which means that they have an inborn susceptibility to develop cancer by virtue of having a very high mutational burden in their tumors because of these defects. The good news for these patients, as illustrated in this trial and as recently approved by the US FDA, is that you also have a much higher likelihood of responding to new immunotherapies called checkpoint blockade inhibitors. And so now we put two and two together, the genomic underpinnings of cancer, a higher mutation load, and the response to these very new immunotherapy drugs, which I think is very exciting and has some specific implications for patients with known susceptibility. One such patient was studied by our group at WashU. I'll just show you this. It's been published now in Cancer Discovery a couple of years ago. This is a very interesting patient with a mutation in a gene called polymerase epsilon, or POLE. This is, again, one of these enzymes that copies the genome during replication of cells, and when it's mutated, these patients have a very high mutation load. We call them ultra-mutators. I think that's because we think nobody can have a higher mutation load than people with these defects. But this patient in particular came to our attention with his brain cancer. He developed subsequently what we call a drop metastasis, so still within the CNS, but lower down on his spinal cord. All three of these tumors were removed and studied by our group. In the context of his clinical care, it was determined by Foundation Medicine testing that he had a germline, inherited mutation in polymerase epsilon. And so when we sequenced his tumor, we found a correspondingly very, very high mutation rate And based on what I just told you, he was given this checkpoint blockade inhibitor. And these are just figures from the paper that show before the treatment with the checkpoint blockade inhibitor, we're staining in these 3 panels for 3 different types of immune molecules, mainly T cells. After he receives the checkpoint blockade inhibitor, pembrolizumab, or Keytruda is the marketing name, now the dark staining indicates the influx of different immune molecules, helper T cells, CD4 positive and CD8 T cells into his tumor site in the second removal of the metastasis. So between metastasis 1 and 2, he received the drug. Even in the CNS, which is protected from the immune molecules by the blood-brain barrier, we see this influx of specific T cells combating his cancer. And these are just immunohistochemistry stains to illustrate that. Importantly, we were also able to sequence the RNA from these tissues, and we also show the RNA signature of these different molecules as well as others that are evidence of the immune response for this patient. And this is a new area of cancer immunology, which is sequencing the RNA of the tumor and then beginning to assign those gene expression signatures for different immune molecules that are present in the tumor itself. I'll just finish now by talking about our newest efforts in brain cancer at the pediatric hospital where I now work. And this is really important work, in my opinion, for the fact that's stated on this slide. It used to be that leukemia, which is the most common cancer in children, was the top killer. We've now got that reasonably under control, and now brain cancer rises to the top as the leading cause of death from all disease, not just cancer, in our kids. Again, we look at this diagram, but you'll notice now on the left-hand side, I've added some additional components to talk about the immune component for this type of sequencing. So this is a patient, again, just leading into the brain cancer work that we've done that we sequenced at WashU. We just had this paper accepted now in this new journal, Molecular Case Studies. And what you can see from this patient is the same tumor occurring multiple times. 5 times in total, from the primary all the way through. And each time the tumor is removed by surgery, so we have each one of those occurrences to study. And what you can see from the bar graphs, going from the top, which is her first occurrence, all the way to the bottom, which is her most recent occurrence, is new and different patterns emerging in some of the mutations that are identified. That's what each one of those bars corresponds to. But what you see never going away are the bars on the left-hand side. Those are mutations that are present in every iteration of this child's tumor. And that tells us a really important fact. The tumor cells never go away. They continue to come back. With different therapies, which are on the left or the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see that different mutations emerge, and then in the new version of the tumor, they may go away. But that founder clone never leaves. And what we did with this patient along the lines of immuno-oncology, as Patrick referred to in his comments, is we studied her tumor at that last occurrence, and we identified the neoantigens in her tumor. And we did this approach that we have pioneered, really, to use the genomics to inform us about peptides that are there occurring unique to the cancer because of the mutations that are in those cancer cells that also may spark a response from that patient's immune system. And if we can vaccinate the patient against their own cancer, we may elicit that new response to the tumor. And so this just shows the results from Victoria's sequencing, where you can see on the lower right-hand side that we were able to identify different neoantigens in every one of the subclones of her tumor, but most importantly, in that founder clone, those blue bars that never went away, we see multiple examples of neoantigens. They resulted in the production of a DNA vaccine with 10 neoantigens included in it, which she has now received and has had a partial response in her recurrent tumor as observed by imaging on the brain. And she continues to have a partial response to this vaccine, and we continue to monitor her by imaging. So she's really the inspiration for our work at Nationwide Children's Hospital, where we have now been conducting this pediatric brain cancer initiative since April of 2017. We identified our first case around that time. This is an infant about 6 years old with a brainstem tumor that was removed. And I work now very closely with our pathologists, and we are focusing, as you can see on this study, especially on kids with indeterminate diagnosis from pathology. So I have to include, when I talk about this, the differential diagnosis that I obtained when I got this tumor into my lab for study from the pathologist. Don't try to read it. The upshot is it's all the things that it might be but might not be, okay? And so this is what we call an indeterminate diagnosis. We don't know. And he sent it to me in an email and said, I'm looking forward to your genomic elucidation. So we sequenced this child's tumor, Nolan, and what we identified was this very interesting but also already known fusion between two genes, FGFR1 and TAC1. This was clinically confirmed in the laboratory, so we can write it into his medical record and he can be treated for this fusion. This is an inversion on chromosome 8. As I mentioned, it's already been identified previously in these genomic studies, these discovery-based studies I told you about in pediatric and adult brain tumors. And this is potentially responsible to a multitude of FGFR inhibitors, which are now in clinical trials. So the plan for Nolan is we'll wait to see if his brain tumor recurs, and then he could be eligible for a clinical trial. Here's a similar child. I won't bore you with too many of these examples, but just for the purposes of illustration, this is Tess, who presented not with an indeterminate diagnosis, but with a pilocytic astrocytoma, multiple changes in her genome, as you can see from the description, but the analysis of her RNA and the DNA as a follow-on shows us that she has a BRAF fusion into this other gene, KIAA1549. These are all known. Interestingly, you don't treat these patients with a BRAF inhibitor. That accelerates the growth of these tumors. That's bad. Instead, you treat them with a MEK inhibitor, and MEK is just the gene downstream of BRAF in the pathway that's upregulated by this fusion. So these are just a few examples where we're now beginning to impact the clinical course for these children because we can offer this molecular diagnosis and we can provide that back to our treating oncologists for consideration in their treatment plan. And this is the way I see genomic medicine. It's just one extra piece of evidence that we provide back of highly precise information that figures into that doctor's evaluation of how best to treat the patient. I'll just finish by saying that we do plan to continue this work looking at RNA as well, because RNA, as I see it, really gives us the readout of the biology that's taking place in the tumor. And one of the things that we've started to do is use this approach called principal components analysis that allows us to take each individual patient's RNA, compare it to all of the other RNA signatures of all of the other patients that we've evaluated, and say, where does it group? What's the similar biology, even if the diagnosis is indeterminate from pathology? And as you can kind of see, sort of groups starting to form here in this admittedly small number of samples that we've sequenced. But I'll point you out, importantly, to the green dot on the right-hand side, which doesn't really group with anybody, and that's a patient with multiple myeloma, an adult that we just happened to sequence. So this actually works to sort of group out things that are not brain cancer and group together things like these pilocytic astrocytomas, the orange dots that are down in the lower left-hand corner that are all biologically grouping together based on their RNA sequence. So more on this, as we go along. But the idea here is that we'll provide web-based resources so that anyone sequencing an RNA from a tumor anywhere in the world can essentially do this principal components analysis compared to our database and those of others and really come back to their own information about that child and the biology of their tumor, or that adult for that matter. So I'll just give you a final result here from this brain cancer initiative. So far, through our first 18 patients, we now have 30 patients total on this study. but not results yet in hand for all of them. And as you can see from the initial 18, about 50% of these have a druggable result, i.e. alteration that corresponds to one or more therapies that they might benefit from. Of course, we're not always good at finding things, so 3 of these patients so far are inconclusive based on our genomic testing. So I'll just finish then with a quick comment about what I think the future is, and this is not all-encompassing, but just a few thoughts. I think the clear challenge is really accelerating the speed of the data analysis. How fast can we do this? Not just for patients with cancer, but what about the babies in our neonatal intensive care unit that are struggling to survive and need a genetic diagnosis in 24 or 48 hours at the longest? We really have to be smart, not only about how fast we can generate the sequencing data, but how fast we can turn around those analyses, because that is now the rate-limiting step. Data integration is critical. As I've already tried to illustrate, it's not enough to just sequence DNA, but RNA, protein, methylation, chromatin conformation, all of these things sort of figure into the genomic diagnosis. Of course, in a hospital system, they also raise the cost of that diagnosis, so we have to be careful, and we have to apply this when it's needed, not just all the time. And then expanding our understanding of healthy tissue biology, I think, is something that we don't often think about. You know, as geneticists historically for hundreds of years, we're fascinated and focused on disease. But what is it about health? And wouldn't that give us a much more important and informative contrast if we knew more about what health was as opposed to disease? And so we continue to focus on this. We have a Healthy Kids initiative that's rolling out in our clinics, and we'll start to enroll and study the genomics and other omics of healthy children to really better understand children with disease. And then lastly, and I'll just, from the Human Genome Project, I'm committed to data sharing, as I already mentioned. I think by virtue of sharing data, we learn so much more from others, not just our own efforts. And so we are, actively involved in data sharing and also developing tools out to make that shared data more informative for people who may not have large numbers of bioinformaticians. So I want to finish by just thanking my colleagues and my new colleague, Francis, I guess, by virtue of my degree, and to thank him for his friendship and also for his support of my being nominated for this incredible honor, which I'm so happy to share here with you today. And I just want to finish by saying merci à tous and add my new affiliation. Thank you very much.
Madame la professeure Hélène Mardy, it is my profound pleasure and honor, with due respects, to deliver you the title of Doctor Honoris Causa in the name of Université d'Evry-Val d'Essonne. For you being a visionary, for you being a pioneer, for your disruptive ideas, and more importantly, for doing the job.
Thank you.
For your achievements to provide the world with revolutionary skills to decipher the complexity and dynamics of genomes. For you being a woman in science, which should not be, but which still remains a fight. For the message of peace and hope embedded in the knowledge of genomes. For you being at the forefront of those next generation fights that will provide human beings more safe and precise means just to save lives.
Crystal.
I've got it. Thank you.
And just to finish, the mayor of Évry wanted you to have a souvenir.
Oh, wonderful.
Unfortunately, he's not here, unable to be there.
But I have this prayer. It's middle of a city and a larger city. For Paris Sud. Agglomération.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Je vais vous faire la bise. Congratulations. Maria? Maybe you say a few words.
Well, thank you again. It's wonderful to be joined by everyone and to have these incredible honors bestowed. I'll never forget it. And so I really, really thank you for coming in and for enjoying this very special day with me. Thank you very much.